The Sanskrit word Vibhu means the Supreme Lord, who is full of unlimited knowledge, riches, strength, fame, beauty, and renunciation. He is always satisfied in himself, undisturbed by sinful or pious activities. He does not create a particular situation for any living entity, but the living entity, bewildered by ignorance, desires to be put into certain conditions of life, and thereby his chain of action and reaction begins. A living entity is, by superior nature, full of knowledge. Nevertheless, he is prone to be influenced by ignorance due to his limited power. The Lord is omnipotent, but the living entity is not. The Lord is Vibhu or omniscient, but the living entity is Anu or atomic. Because he is a living soul, he has the capacity to desire by his free will. Such desire is fulfilled only by the omnipotent Lord. And so, when the living entity is bewildered in his desires, the Lord allows him to fulfill those desires. But the Lord is never responsible for the actions and reactions of the particular situation which may be desired. Being in a bewildered condition, therefore, the embodied soul identifies himself with the circumstantial material body and becomes subjected to the temporary misery and happiness of life. The Lord is the constant companion of the living entity as Paramatma or the super soul, and therefore he can understand the desires of the individual soul as one can smell the flavor of a flower by being near it. Desire is a subtle form of conditioning of the living entity. The Lord fulfills his desire as he deserves. Man proposes and God disposes. The individual is not therefore omnipotent in fulfilling his desires. The Lord, however, can fulfill all desires, and the Lord, being neutral to everyone, does not interfere with the desires of the minute independent living entities. However, when one desires Krishna, the Lord takes special care and encourages one to desire in such a way that one can attain him and be eternally happy. The Vedic hymn therefore declares, Esha u hi eva sadhu karma karyati tam yamebhyo lokebhya unninishate Esha u eva sadhu karma karyati yamadho ninashate agnajantur anisho yam atmanah sukha dukkhayoho Ishvara prerito gachet swargam vasvabharm evacha. The Lord engages the living entity in pious activities so he may be elevated. The Lord engages him in impious activities so he may go to hell. The living entity is completely dependent in his distress and happiness. By the will of the Supreme, he can go to heaven or hell, as a cloud is driven by the air. Therefore, the embodied soul, by his immemorial desire to avoid Krishna consciousness, causes his own bewilderment. Consequently, although he is constitutionally eternal, blissful, and cognizant, due to the littleness of his existence, he forgets his constitutional position of service to the Lord and is thus entrapped by nescience. And under the spell of ignorance, the living entity claims that Lord is responsible for his conditional existence. The Vedanta Sutras also confirm this. Vaishamya nairgrinye na sapeksha tvat tathahi darshayati. The Lord neither hates nor likes anyone, though he appears to. Thus ends the Transcendental Bhakti Vedanta purport. Om Ajnanatimirandasya Jnananjanashalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prishtaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakti Vedanta Swami Niti Namine Namaste Saraswate Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Pashyata Deshatarine Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna. So we are discussing the 5th chapter, Karma Yoga, Action in Krishna Consciousness. And we are in the second section of the chapter, where 3 kinds of doers are being described. So as we saw in the verse 13, the second section begins from verse 13 and goes up to 16. So in the verse 13, it is being mentioned that when the embodied living being, when he acts in his own true nature and mentally renounces all actions, then although one is living in the city of these 9 gates, one can be still happy. And similarly, in the last verse yesterday, we saw that the embodied spirit, master of the city of this body, does not create activities, nor does he induce people to act, nor does he create the fruits of action. All this is enacted by the modes of material nature. So here it is being said that the embodied spirit is different from the material activities that are taking place. And all this is enacted by the modes of material nature. And therefore, one can also say that, okay, the living entity is not responsible for the distresses or the different kinds of reactions that the living entity is facing, because the embodied spirit is different from the body, and it is the modes of material nature that is enacted, that is enacting the various actions and reactions. Or someone may say, if it is not the spirit soul that is responsible for this, then maybe the Supreme Lord is responsible for my conditional existence. And in this verse, the Lord is describing that actually it is not the case. So it is being said, na adate kashachit papam na chaiva sukritim vibhuhu. So as we will see in the purport, Srila Prabhupada is elaborating on this word called vibhuhu. So the word vibhuhu is being described as a Supreme Lord. So na adate, vibhuhu na adate. So the Supreme Lord does not accept or does not assume kashchit, anyone's papam, that is sinful or sin, and sukritam, nor the pious activities. So the Supreme Lord is not responsible for anyone's sins or pious activities. And sometimes we see that people are confused, bewildered by what is action, what is reaction, and they sometimes blame it on someone else, as someone else is responsible for my condition of what I am. I'm confused. Maybe I did not get some proper education. Maybe my circumstances are not proper. And there could be many other reasons people can give as why they are confused, why they are bewildered. But here it is being said there is one prime reason as what is the reason for the bewilderment of the living entity. And that is being described as Ajnanena Avritam. So when one is filled with ignorance, then what does it do? The ignorance, Avritam Gnanam, it covers knowledge. Because of ignorance, one is not able to see things with knowledge. He is not having the Gnana Chakshusha, the vision of knowledge. And therefore, what happens? Tena muhyanti. Muhyanti means bewildered. So therefore, because of lack of knowledge, one is bewildered. And here the word Jantava refers to living entities. So when the living entities are not having knowledge, or when they're covered with ignorance, when they're ignorant, which covers the knowledge, they're bewildered. So we'll see further as what this verse means, as what is the cause of living entities' bewilderment. What is that is actually causing trouble for the living entity. So in the very beginning, in the purport, Srila Prabhupada is beginning the purport by saying, defining the word vibhu. So the word vibhu, Srila Prabhupada refers, means the Supreme Lord. The Supreme Lord has innumerable names. Nam Nam Akari Bahuda Nija Sarva Shaktis. Tatrarpita Niyamita Smaranena Kalaha. So Nam Nam Akari Bahuda. So Lord has innumerable names. And why Lord has innumerable names? Because the Lord's qualities are innumerable. The Lord's activities are innumerable. And because of this, Lord has various names. And therefore, we call Lord either by his qualities, Shyama Sundara, or one could call Yashoda Nandana, he is son of Mother Yashoda, or because of his activities. So in this way, the Lord is described in various names. And each of these names are very, very potent. So whenever the Lord being absolute in his nature, whenever one chants or utters the name of the Lord, they are all of potencies. They're all of spiritual potencies. And therefore, Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu says, Nam Nam Akari Bahuda Nija Sarva Shaktis. They're all Sarva Shaktis. They are filled with all potencies. And here in this verse, there is another name of the Supreme Lord that's been described is as Vibhuhu. And Prabhupada describes who is Supreme Lord. So Prabhupada gives the translation for the verse from Vishnu Purana, which describes who is the Supreme Lord. And this is the definition given by Parasara Muni, the father of Veda Vyasa, who says, Aishwaryasya samagrasya viryasya yashasha shriyaha jnana vairagyas chaiva shannam bhaga itingana. So this is the definition of the Supreme Lord. If one wants to understand how does one define Supreme Lord? So this is one of the standard definition that we use to understand who is the Supreme Lord. And Prabhupada would often use this definition to ask, is he full of opulence? Does he have full strength? Can he lift Govardhan Hill? He is claiming I'm God, but can he do these wonderful activities? Or does he possess these wonderful qualities of the Lord? And Prabhupada would refute various people who claim themselves to be God. So let us look at what this verse means and what are the 6 opulences of the Lord. So Aishwaryasya, he is full of riches. So Prabhupada says, Shad Aishwarya Purnam. So the Supreme Lord has got the 6 qualities, Shad Aishwarya Purnam. So he has got this wonderful 6 qualities, Samagrasya, incomplete, in full. So not that he has got these qualities in partial, he has got these qualities in full. Viryasya, he is full of strength. Yashasha, he is full of fame. Shriyaha, he is full of beauty. Jnana, he is full of knowledge. Vairagya is full of renunciation. So these 6 qualities, when one possesses in complete, in full, then one is said to be Supreme Lord, and then one can be called as Vibhuhu. If one does not have these qualities, one is not said to be the Supreme Lord. And artificially, there are so many gods who appear in various times saying themselves to be God. But again, it is very important to recognize that one is not to be understood as an incarnation of the Lord unless it is mentioned in the scriptures and unless one demonstrates the qualities of the Supreme Lord. And Srila Prabhupada would often demonstrate this to clarify as who is to be considered as the Supreme Lord. Now, then Prabhupada also goes on to explain furthermore what are the qualities of the Supreme Lord. The Supreme Lord who is Vibhu, who has got all these potencies. As we see in also Srimad Bhagavatam, the first canto, first verse, first chapter, it is mentioned, Janmadi yasya yatha anvayad itaratascha ardheshu abhignaswarat. So abhignaswarat, the Supreme Lord, is the source of the material and spiritual creation. And he is also full of cognizant, is fully independent. And as we see, the first verse of Srimad Bhagavatam is describing the nature of the Supreme Lord, who is the Param Satyam. And similarly, we see various definitions in Bhagavad Gita, and here is another nature or another quality of the Supreme Lord that's being mentioned by Srila Prabhupada, is that he is full is fully always self-satisfied. Is always self-satisfied. So usually the common living entities, we are never self-satisfied. So we are always seeking satisfaction in something else, something outside us. And because of lack of satisfaction, we are trying to do so many different activities which might give us satisfaction. But this is not the case with the Supreme Lord. Supreme Lord is always sent person. He's never unsatisfied, in spite of any circumstances, any conditions, never unsatisfied. And here is another prayer, which is said by Kunti Maharani. Namo kinchanaya vittaya nivritta gunavrittaye atma ramaya shantaya kaivalya pataye namaha. So this is prayers which are offered by Kunti Maharani to Lord Krishna. In these prayers, Kunti Maharani also describes the various qualities of the Lord. And here in this one place, she is mentioning Atma Ramaya Shantaya. So here also she is describing that how Lord is fully self-satisfied. And it is said that the devotees, when they also serve the Supreme Lord, Anya Abhilashita Shunyam, when they also render service to the Supreme Personality of Godhead without any other desire, without any motivation for karma or jnana, and without any expectation, and always engaged in service, when their desires are purified and when they are also engaged in pure devotional service, then it is said that the living entity can also be self-satisfied. As we see in the various, in Chaitanya Charitamrita, there is description about who is peaceful, who is satisfied. Only a devotee is considered to be satisfied. This is because his desires are purified. He is completely engaged in his constitutional position. He is constantly engaged in the devotional service of the Lord. And because he is connected with the Supreme Lord and is engaged in the service of the Supreme Lord without any other desire, he can be satisfied, but no one else. So in the beginning of this purport, we can see that Prabhupada is explaining about the Lord's nature, Vibhu, and then Prabhupada goes on to explain the condition or the nature of the living entity. Prabhupada says that the living entity is, while the Supreme Lord is Vibhu, Vibhu, very great, but the living entity is Anu, is infinitesimal, is very small. And just like the Supreme Lord, as we saw yesterday, and also today morning, we saw the definition of the living entity, the energy is, the living entity is a marginal energy of the Supreme Lord. Whereas the Supreme Lord is infallible. The living entity, being marginal in energy, is fallible. That means the living entity can sometimes come under the influence of ignorance. Whereas the Supreme Lord does not ever come under the influence of the three modes of material nature. He is always aloof. Ishvara, Paramaha, Krishna, Satchitananda Vigraha. He is always in the spiritual form, with full of Sat, Chit and Ananda. Whereas the living entity, although is Sat, Chit and Ananda, it is not, it's minute in quantity. And because of this minuteness, the living entity can be prone or influenced by the material energy. And because of this, the living entity is prone to ignorance. And what does this ignorance means? Ignorance means forgetfulness of one's own position. When one forgets one's own identity, if I do not know that if I'm a student in a college and a university, and say by chance I forget that I'm a student, then I may not perform the activities which I'm supposed to perform. And because I do not perform the activities which I'm supposed to perform, then I may fail in the exam, and I may be demoted to a lower class or something, or maybe I've been thrown out of the university itself. So basically, when I forget my position, when I forget my activities which I'm supposed to do, the consequences are unfavorable. So just like in a normal university or normal setting, if you forget our duty, the consequences are unfavorable. Similarly, in our existential life, If we prone to forget things, then we undergo unwanted consequences or miserable consequences. And this is one of the nature of the living entity. And therefore, the living entity must be aware of this, that as there is a saying, that many do not know that they do not know. So the usual condition of the living entities are that they do not know that they do not know, that they are in a ignorance. And that's why the various devotees, acharyas, the Supreme Lord himself, out of his causeless mercy, although he's never prone to ignorance, although he's aloof from the material creation, he comes to the material world just to wake the sleeping souls so that they come to the real understanding of who they are, what they are supposed to do, what is the goal of life, and what is this all material existence is all about, what is this ignorance all about. So here is another verse where the Supreme Lord is again telling the living entity that the living entity is confused or bewildered because of its nature. And more specifically, we will see in next couple of lines as how Srila Prabhupada is describing what is that fundamental reason why the living entity is prone to this cause of ignorance. And because of this ignorance, one is put in bewilderment or confusion, is confused. So moving on, Prabhupada says, also mentions that the living entity is superior the living entity is considered superior in nature compared to material energy because the living entity is conscious. The living entity has freedom to desire, freedom to choose. Whereas the material energy is not free to choose. It cannot act, it cannot control the living entity. Whereas the living entity has the freedom to control the material energy. At the same time, the living entity has the freedom or free will to desire. Now, this is a very important aspect that we should know, that the living entity, although minute in its nature, has this freedom given by the Supreme Lord. And because of this freedom, the living entity can choose which way to go. And as we will see further, that Prabhupada also mentions that the desire is a subtle form of conditioning for so in the conditioned state, the desire that the living entity is having is a subtle form of conditioning for the living entity. What this means is that because of the conditioning of the living entity in its forgetful state, the conditioning means the living entity now, when put in a new atmosphere, which is of material existence, now by repeated presence in the material existence, the living entity is conditioned to think that I am the product of this material world. I am supposed to achieve something in this material world. My gain is in terms of name, fame, my pride, my family, my achievements, my so many things that I do in the material world. The living entity thinks that this is what I am supposed to do. And being in a society of peers where people are saying, oh, how much wealth have you done? Where are your children studying? Or different kinds of goals people have in the material world. And the living entity being in this atmosphere repeatedly thinks, these are my goals. These are also should be supposed to be my goals of my family. And therefore, the living entity tries various means to acquire things and desire initially, and then acquire those desires. And because the living entity is free to desire, and therefore in the conditioned state, the desire also conditions even further the living entity. And furthermore, it is said that sometimes the living entity thinks that I'm not responsible for my condition. It is the external circumstances that is cause for my struggle for existence. But here in this purport, Srila Prabhupada is very clearly saying the real problem why the living entity is in miserable condition or is bewildered is because of misuse of desire. It is the desire which is the most fundamental element of the living entity. It is, as we will see in the next verse, as this is the verse which is spoken by Kunti Maharani. Bhave asmin klishyamananam avidya kama karma bhi shravana smarana arahani karishyan iti kechana. Bhave asmin klishyamananam. So bhave means in this material existence, klishyamananam, of those who are suffering from. So as I mentioned earlier, the Kunti Maharani is also mentioning in her prayers the various reasons why Lord has appeared. And here Kunti Maharani is giving another reason as why the Supreme Lord has appeared. So Kunti Maharani is saying that the Lord has appeared to regenerate Shravana, Smarana, Arahani. So the Supreme Lord has appeared so as to regenerate the devotional service of hearing, remembering, and worshipping. Now, why should the Lord appear in this? Appear so as to regenerate these things? The reason being, the living entity being ignorant is desiring something and which is creating more suffering for the living entities. So the words avidya, kama, karma, bhi are very important to note. So when the living entity is in ignorance, that is avidya, the living entity, the karma, the activities or the desires, karma, the desires which the living entity desires is actually born out of ignorance. And when the living entity acts upon those desires, karma bhi starts acting, the living entity's consequences are binding. The living entity, when in ignorance starts to desire, the desiring is in a subtle form of conditioning, already in the conditional world. And when the living entity starts acting upon those desires, the desires, the actions bring certain reactions, and usually these reactions bind one to the material world instead of freeing. So one of the quality of knowledge is that Prabhupada mentions knowledge in one place, that it means the opportunity or the ability of the spirit soul to be freed from the 24 elements. It is to liberate the spirit soul from these 24 elements. And avidya means to entangle the spirit soul more and more into these 24 elements or the material nature. So this one simple fact of avidya is leading innumerable desires into us, which are all binding, which are all causing for our prolonged existence in this material world. And therefore, Kunti Maharani is saying that, oh Lord, you have appeared, some say, Kechana, others say that you have appeared just to regenerate Shravana, Smarana, Arahani, so that the conditioned souls can come out of this suffering, come out of this ignorance. And when the ignorance goes away, one develops the right desires. I am not a product of this material world. I am supposed to be engaged in the service of the Lord. I am supposed to engage all my energies to please spiritual master and Krishna. And therefore, how can I engage? How can I engage my words, intelligence, body in the service of the Lord? And therefore, all my activities are to be centered around this knowledge of my constitutional position. And therefore, the Lord appears. And when this is not understood, the living entity under ignorance desires to be put in a certain condition of life, and that condition life not being not in knowledge, the living entity's desires entangle the living entity in different situations in the material existence. And therefore, his chain of actions and reactions begin. So it is important to recognize that if we really want to make a solution of our struggle for existence, the most important and the fundamental aspect that we need to take care of is our desire. What are we desiring? Are we desiring some more material benefits? Are we desiring some sort of jnana? Or are we desiring the service of the Lord? What is our desires? So to keep a check of desires is very, very important, because it is a desire which leads one to develop, to think, will, and feel. So once that desire comes, the living entity wants to act upon it. So Prabhupada says that this act, the living entity who has this ability to think, will, and act, Prabhupada says, even if sometimes some thoughts come, a devotee should not will and should not act upon it. By chance, sometimes some thoughts may come, but the devotee must recognize that I should not misuse my freedom of desire. I should not, as we see, Sanjayate, Sanjay,
Sangat
Sangat
Sanjayate
Sanjayate Kamaha. So, by association, by contemplation, we develop an attachment towards it. So even though there may be some thoughts that may come, we should not contemplate upon it. We should go back, oh, this is not what I'm supposed to do. This is sense gratification. Let me chant the holy name of the Lord. Let me read something. Let me move away from it. So one should not will, desire, contemplate, and then act upon it. If one does, if Prabhupada says a devotee must be very cautious as not to act. And that, Prabhupada says, determines the advancement of the devotee, that he should be matured, he should become controlled in his willing and acting. And Prabhupada in this purport is saying, under ignorance, the living entity claims that Lord is responsible for his conditional existence. So it is only in ignorance that the living entity is thinking that someone else is responsible for my condition, or sometimes the Lord is responsible for my conditional existence. No. So if we want the true freedom that we can, Satchit Ananda, not being bound by any laws of material nature, it is our own desire, which is, if we desire, it's our own desire by which we have come into this material world, and it is by our own desire we can go back again to the spiritual world. So this desire, if we can develop strong desire in our heart, Vyavasayatmika buddhi ekehe kurunandanaha. So that undeviated desire to serve the spiritual master, to serve the Supreme Lord, if that desires are developed, then one is, as we saw in today's progressive path of salvation. So if one wants to move forward in this direction of freedom from conditional existence, then the process is to render unalloyed, single-pointed attention to serve the spiritual master and the Supreme Lord. So it's very important to recognize our desires. And further, as in the purport, Prabhupada is saying that the living entity is the one who is desiring. And then what is the role of the Supreme Lord? What is he doing? So, as we will see in the purport, which Prabhupada is briefly mentioning from this verse, Upadrashtanumanta cha bharta bhokta maheshwaraha paramatmeti chapi ukto dehe asmin purusha paraha. So, Upadrashta means overseer. Anumanta, permitter. The Supreme Lord, in the form of Paramatma, is overseeing our desires. So he is present in our heart, and as we will see in the further example, as how as soon as we desire, the Supreme Lord is able to recognize that. He can oversee, he can see that, oh, he is desiring this. And based upon what he deserves, permitter. So the Lord, when he senses the desire of the living entity, based upon what the living entity desires, the Lord also permits it. Anumanta. So here in this verse, it is being said in the 13th chapter that the Supreme Lord, who is Bharta, who is the master, he is also present within the body, with the embodied living entity. The Supreme Lord is also present, who is the supreme enjoyer and the supreme proprietor as Paramatma, and he is overseeing what the living entity is desiring, and therefore is also allowing the living entity to permit as he deserves. And therefore, Prabhupada is also mentioning in the purport that man proposes and God disposes. The Lord fulfills his desire as he deserves. So therefore, it is important to recognize that without the mercy of the Lord, it is not possible for the desires to be fulfilled. The living entity is not just the sole cause, or is not omnipotent. It's not Vibhu, it's very Anu. Therefore, he can only desire, but it is not completely in his hand that he can actually achieve the result or the desired activity or the desired result. As we can see, the living entity is not the owner of the body also, because the material nature has provided this body. And this body belongs to the Supreme Lord. But in the conditioned state, the living entity thinks, oh, I've got this wonderful body and I am the controller of this body. With this body, I will achieve this, I will achieve that, I will achieve that. But we never know when disease comes, when death comes. And therefore, this false conception of life that I am in control of everything. It is by my abilities alone I can achieve anything. This is very misconstrued understanding a living entity possesses. And because of this, the living entity gets further entangled without recognizing that there is another permitter in the heart, who is the Supreme Lord, as Paramatma, who is actually permitting, he is actually allowing the material nature to adjust the things in such a way that my desire get fulfilled. So if you look carefully in our own lives, if not for the guidance, as we see in the Bhagavad Gita 15th chapter, the Sarvasya chaham hridi sannivisto matta smritir jnanam apohanam cha. So matta smritir jnanam apohanam cha. So the Supreme Lord Sarvasya chaham hridi sannivisto, he is seated in everyone's heart, and from him comes smritir, that is remembrance, jnanam, knowledge, apohanam, and forgetfulness. So if not for the knowledge that the Supreme Lord is helping us to have, we cannot even do our basic activities. As we see in some diseases, they forget everything. They're not able to recognize their name, where they are, what they are. So if the Supreme Lord takes away that ability to know something, smritir, jnanam, then we cannot even do any basic things. So it is very important to recognize that without the sanction of the Supreme Lord, it is not possible for even our desires to be fulfilled. And therefore, this knowledge of Bhagavad Gita helps us to understand these principles of the real principles of life, as what should be our desire, under whose guidance these desires are fulfilled. So we can be grateful to the Supreme Lord. Oh, by your mercy, I am able to have something today. And we must be grateful to the Lord, knowing that how Lord is so merciful that he is constantly helping us forget the past unwanted things. We have so many unwanted desires, unwanted activities that we have done in our life, but the Supreme Lord is so merciful that he is also allowing us to forget some things. He is also giving us knowledge how to act in different circumstances. And therefore, we must be very grateful to the Lord for us, how he is helping us in all circumstances. And it is also very important that we always, when we render service, we should always seek, as Madhupandit Prabhu also says often, that we should seek the guidance of Paramatma. We should work in tandem with Paramatma, means in alignment with Paramatma. We should seek permission of Guru and Paramatma, and then engage in service so that we are acting in the right way. Further, there is also the analogy of flower that is being mentioned here. Prabhupada writes here that so the just like so here Prabhupada mentions about so just like when one comes very close, one can smell the fragrance of the flower. Similarly, the Supreme Lord, who is present as Paramatma, close to the heart, he can also smell our desires. And it is very important to recognize this one more important aspect of the Lord, that although he senses the desire, he is able to perceive what are the desires of the living entity, he does not interfere with them. He allows the minute independence that is given to the living entity to not to be interfered. And the living entity has got this freedom to act as he wills. And therefore, it is very important that when we develop the right knowledge, we also change our desires. The desires to acquire various material possessions, the various name, fame, and wealth, beauty. So all these material goals get transformed when we acquire this knowledge. And therefore, it is very important that when the living entity forgets to go towards Krishna, the living entity is because of his own desires is bewildered. But the same living entity, when desires to go towards Krishna, so again, when the living entity just makes little desire to go towards Krishna, again, Krishna, who is present in the heart, who is also able to perceive all the desires, he immediately thinks, oh, here is the living entity who is trying to hear about my glories, who's trying to hear about my teachings. So immediately the Supreme Lord facilitates facilitates more knowledge to that living entity. So as we also see here in Srimad Bhagavatam, it is mentioned that Shrinvatam Swakata Krishna Punya Shravana Kirtanaha Hridyantastohi Abhadrani Vidunoti Shrut Satam. So Shrinvatam Swakatha Krishna. So as soon as one starts hearing about Krishna from Vedic literatures or to hear his teachings directly from Bhagavad Gita, then Krishna, who is dwelling in everyone's heart, Hridyantastohi Abhadrani Vidunoti Shrut Satam. And how is he present in the heart? As Shrut Satam, he is very, very dear. And what is he doing? As a best wishing friend, he purifies the devotee who constantly engages in hearing of him. So Hridyantastohi Abhadrani. So when one starts hearing about the Supreme Lord who is present within the heart, the Lord immediately removes this thing from our heart called Abhadrani. And it is very important to recognize that Srila Prabhupada mentions in this verse purport that Abhadrani or inauspiciousness means to desire material things. To have material desires is Abhadrani. And the Supreme Lord, as soon as we start hearing about the Supreme Lord, in the form of Srimad Bhagavatam, Bhagavad Gita, and read them, then immediately the first transformation, one of the important transformation that takes place in the heart of the living entity is the transformation of desires. And how is that possible? Because the Lord who is present in the heart, he recognizes because of this material desires, he's been struggling life after life. Now he's starting to turn towards me, he's trying to hear about me, he's trying to hear about my message, and therefore let me cleanse this desire from his heart. And therefore we see that the living entities are, when sometimes devotees tell, oh, we don't eat anywhere outside, we don't have any interest in eating out, we don't have any interest in going out. Oh, you are not at all interested in all these things? How do you live your life? This is because that desire is no more present in the heart. By the mercy of the Supreme Lord, that desire has gone away. And as we see also in the prayers that we just recited, Nasta Prayeshu Abhadreshu, again the word Abhadreshu, Nityam Bhagavata Sevaya. So again, so if one starts hearing Krishna Katha every day, regularly, always, then immediately this abhadra, this unwanted desires from the heart will vanquish. So it is when this unwanted qualities from our heart gets vanquished, then chete eter anavidham, then there is this purification of our consciousness takes place. And it is in this state that we can come to the mode of goodness. Because of too much of passion, we have too many desires, greediness, and it is very, very difficult. People are having so many desires. They want to run from one desire to another desire to another desire. And the Lord who is watching as Anumanta, as Upadrashta, he is seeing, oh, he is asking for this, that, okay, let us permit something, so let us permit something. But if the same desires, if we turn towards Krishna, then Krishna, dadami buddhi yogam tam, Krishna will give us knowledge from the heart as how we can make further spiritual advancement. And therefore, the living entity, when he makes an endeavor to come towards Krishna, he will be further guided by the Supreme Lord as Paramatma to come to his eternal, for the living entity to come to his own eternal constitutional position of being eternal, blissful, and all cognizant. Now, if the living entity misuses the free will, then out of one's own misuse of freedom and free will and misuse of one's desiring ability, that the living entity is being in the conditional existence. And therefore, it is very important for the living entity, for all of us to recognize that I should change my desires. I should desire in a way which is favorable for me to go to the spiritual world. And therefore, to strengthen this desire, we need to constantly hear Krishna Katha. And it is by hearing this constant Krishna Katha in the association of devotees that our abhadra, or the unwanted desires, get cleansed, and then we can make advancement in spiritual life. So in just to conclude this, it is important to recognize here that living entities are responsible for their own conditional existence. And the cause of bewilderment, or cause of confusion, or cause of struggle in this conditional life is because of the misuse of desires. And misuse of desires, as Kunti Maharani says, avidya kama karma bihi. It is because of ignorance that one is misusing one's desiring ability. And when one is in ignorance and one is misusing one's desire, and one is in acting and therefore being put into certain kinds of struggling, conditional existence and struggling, the living entity sometimes thinks it is the Supreme Lord is responsible for this. But no, it is not that Supreme Lord is responsible. It is my own desires, my own activities, and my own ignorance is cause for this bewilderment and struggle. And when one recognizes this and one finds a solution as given by the Supreme Lord to hear constantly, then the same desires, when directed towards the Supreme Lord, to understand Him, to serve Him, then He guides the living entity further from this conditional existence and frees one from bewilderment. With this, I'll stop here and see if there are any questions or comments.
Explained it nicely.
Okay. Okay, if there are no questions or comments, we'll stop here. Can I request everyone to come in front of camera? Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna,
Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna,
Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare,
Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare,
Hare Rama, Hare Rama,
Hare Rama, Hare Rama,
Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Rama Rama Hare Hare.
Srimad Bhagavad Gita ki,
Jai.
Shri Prabhupada ki,
Jai.
Gaur Premanante.
Hari Hari Bol.
Thank you all for joining. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.